to abandon our house simply because there are termites in it. Our house must be built on a firm foundation and not built on sand. The principal structure of a society of the makers is the family, and not the government, for the family precedes government and is superior to it. Our mission is to expose the takers for what they really are, not saints, but thieves. In order for us to realize what we are fighting against, we must first realize what we are fighting for, our families and our extended families, which comprise our civilizational inheritance. To end this video, I will quote the intellectual forefather of the reactionary movement, the eminent philosopher and intellectual mentor of Friedrich Hegel, Johann Gottfried von Herder. Nature brings forth families. The most natural state, therefore, is also one people, with a national character of its own. For a people is as much a plant of nature as is a family, except that it has more branches. Nothing therefore seems more contradictory to the true ends of government than the endless expansion of states, the wild confusion of races and nations under one scepter. An empire made up of 100 people and 120 provinces which have been forced together is a monstrosity, not a state body. Freedom is secession. Intellectual, economic, and spiritual secession from the cesspool of thieves. For well over a century, the left has generally been conceded to have morality, justice, and idealism on its side. The conservative opposition to the left has largely been confined to the impracticality of its ideals. A common view, for example, is that socialism is splendid in theory, but that it cannot work in practical life. What the conservatives fail to see is that while short-run gains can indeed be made by appealing to the impracticality of radical departures from the status quo, that by conceding the ethical and the ideal to the left, they were doomed to long-run defeat. For if one side is granted ethics and the ideal from the start, then that side will be able to effect gradual but sure changes in its own direction. And as these changes accumulate, the stigma of impracticality becomes less and less directly relevant. The conservative opposition, having staked its all on the seemingly firm ground of the practical, is doomed to lose as the status quo moves further in the left direction. The fact that the unreconstructed Stalinists are universally considered to be the conservatives in the Soviet Union is a happy logical joke upon conservatism. For in Russia, the unrepentant statists are indeed the repositories of at least a superficially practicality and of a clinging to the existing status quo. Never has the virus of practicality been more widespread than in the United States, for Americans consider themselves practical people, and hence the opposition to the left, while originally stronger than anywhere else, has been perhaps the least firm in its foundation. It is now the advocates of the free market and the free society who have to meet the common charge of impracticality. In no area has the left been granted justice and morality as extensively and almost universally as in its espousal of massive equality. It is rare indeed in the United States to find anyone, especially any intellectual, challenging the beauty and goodness of the egalitarian ideal. So committed is everyone to this ideal that impracticality, that is, the weakening of economic incentives, has been virtually the only criticism against even the most bizarre egalitarian programs. The inexorable march of egalitarianism is an indication enough of the impossibility of avoiding ethical commitments. The fiercely practical Americans, in attempting to avoid ethical doctrines, cannot help setting forth such doctrines, but they can now only do so in unconscious, ad hoc, and unsystematic fashion. Keynes's famous insight that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences, are usually the slave of some defunct economist, is true all the more of ethical judgments and ethical theory. Let us proceed then to a critique of the egalitarian ideal itself. Should equality be granted its current status as an unquestioned ethical ideal? In the first place, we must challenge the very idea of a radical separation between something that is true in theory but not valid in practice. If a theory is correct, then it does work in practice. If it does not work in practice, then it is a bad theory. The common separation between theory and practice is an artificial and fallacious one, but this is true in ethics as well as anything else. If an ethical ideal is inherently impractical, that is, if it cannot work in practice, then it is a poor ideal and should be discarded with. To put it more precisely, if an ethical goal violates the nature of man and or the universe, and therefore cannot work in practice, then it is a bad ideal and should be dismissed as a goal. If the goal itself violates the nature of man, then it is also a poor idea to work in the direction of that goal. Suppose, for example, that it has come to be adopted as a universal ethical goal that all men be able to fly by flapping their arms. Let us assume that pro-flappers have been generally conceded the beauty and goodness of their goal, but have been criticized as impractical. But the result is unending social misery as society tries continually to move in the direction of arm flying, and the preachers of arm flapping makes everyone's lives miserable for being either lax or sinful enough not to live up to the common ideal. The proper critique here is to challenge the ideal goal itself, to point out that the goal itself is impossible in view of the physical nature of man and the universe, and therefore to free mankind from its enslavement to an inherently an impossible and hence evil goal. What in fact is equality? The term has been much invoked but little analyzed. A and B are equal if they are identical to each other with respect to a given attribute. Thus, if Smith and Jones are both exactly 6 feet in height, then they may be said to be equal in height. If 2 sticks are identical in length, then their lengths are equal, etc. There is one and only way, then, in which 2 people can really be equal in the fullest sense. They must be identical in all their attributes. This means, of course, that equality of all men, the egalitarian ideal, can only be achieved if all men are precisely uniform, precisely identical with respect to all of their attributes. The egalitarian world would necessarily be a world of horror fiction, a world of faceless and identical creatures devoid of all individuality, variety, or special creativity. The age-old record of inequality seems to indicate that this variability and diversity is rooted in the biological nature of man, but it is precisely such a conclusion about biology and human nature that is the most galling of all impossible irritants to our egalitarians. Even egalitarians would be hard put to deny the historical record, but their answer is that culture has been to blame. And since they obviously hold that culture is a pure act of the will, then the goal of changing the culture and inculcating society with equality seems to be attainable. In this area, the egalitarians slow off any pretense to scientific caution. They are scarcely content with acknowledging biology and culture as mutually interacting influences. Biology must be read out of court quickly and totally. The egalitarian revolt against biological reality, as significant as it is only a subset of a deeper revolt against the ontological structure of reality itself. against the very organization of nature, against the universe as such. At the heart of the egalitarian left is the pathological belief that there is no structure of reality, that all of the world is a tabula rasa that can be changed at any moment in any desired direction by the mere exercise of human will. In short, that reality can be instantly transformed by the mere wish or whim of human beings. Surely this sort of infantile thinking is at the heart of Herbert Marcuse's passionate call for the comprehensive negation of the existing structure of reality and for its transformation into what he divines to be its true potential.
Let's recall the story of the return of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, to his palace after being away for 20 years during the Trojan War and subsequent adventures. He finds his palace overrun with strangers lusting after his wife and his kingdom, feasting on his food and corrupting his household with their bad manners. Odysseus doesn't think about dealing with this problem by correcting the manners of his unwanted guests. He simply makes a plan and kills the whole bunch of them, and then he goes about straightening things out. And we might liken our situation in America today to being at a banquet thrown by a gang of unwelcome guests in our palace, a palace that we and our forefathers built with our own hands. I'm inclined to deal with our unwelcome guests the way Odysseus dealt with his. I'm inclined to turn the whole banquet table over onto the floor and then begin splitting skulls right and left. I'm inclined to lay waste to the whole multicultural feast, to spill the blood and brains of the cooks and caterers and waiters, along with those of our unwelcome guests, onto the floor into every filthy alien dish they have prepared for us, and then to take a fire hose and wash the whole mess out the door and into the gutter. I apologize for such a distasteful analogy with our present situation, but I want to explain to you today why I believe that it is essential for us to take a radical rather than a conservative approach to dealing with our unwelcome guests. But what we don't want to do is become so absorbed by any one detail that we forget the big picture. We don't want to slip into the error of believing that we can become healthy again by dealing with just a few specific problems. We don't want to make the mistake of believing that a proper way to make the banquet thrown by our unwanted guests is to avoid the most distasteful dishes that they have prepared for us and nibble at the ones which are a little less obnoxious to us. The problem is that every dish our uninvited guests have prepared for us is poisonous to us in one way or another. They have taken over our pantry and our kitchen. They have substituted their recipe books for ours, and they have very largely remodeled our palace to suit themselves. Whenever they have come across something in the palace which suits our